Joining us now to reflect on the continued significance of Freedom Day is researcher and human rights activist, advocate Sipho Mantula, and he joins us now via our video link. Advocate, thank you so much for your time this evening here on SABC News. I mean, as we reflect on 30 years of democracy and 30 years of freedom in South Africa, what does Freedom Day actually mean for South Africa?
Thank you very much, my sister, and a good evening to your viewers, Mbali. I think it is very important, as you are asking a very potent question, what does Freedom Day means? I think the liberation of the mind is very important. The access to services is very important, as we know that this day also represents the first mark of Africans going to the voting stations. So it is very important that it was the turning of a political system coming from an apartheid system to a people's government. So when you think of freedom, you will think of freedom from want of poverty, freedom from oppression, freedom of media that we are now celebrating today. So it is important to know that, Mbali, the freedom that was fought by all the heroes and heroines in the 1960s, 1980s, 1990s, it is what we are all benefiting out of. So if one looks at the nature of the freedom of South Africa will not be seen outside the context of the African continent also. And I think that's what President Ramaphosa mentioned today, that also South Africa want to thank all those African countries that played their role in the liberation of South Africa. So it is important for us, when you look at our freedom, we need to look back at the role that was played by the other African countries to assist South Africa to attain its liberation and its freedom.
And looking back at what the president said and highlighted in his address was the issue around South Africa being an unequal society. I mean, we are the most unequal society in the world. And, you know, when we celebrate days like Freedom Day, when we're faced with a high unemployment rate, poverty, also a lack of basic services from our government, one would say that how does one celebrate a day like this when you're faced with many challenges of this nature?
That is quite true, but we cannot be nothing to celebrate, but it's always important to deflect on the challenges. And like I said, he said that South Africa, it is a baby, and I don't think we are a baby, we are a matured, liberated country out of the shackles of apartheid. Looking at two countries also that were celebrating their freedom today, being Togo and Sierra Leone, they are still facing the same challenges we are facing of energy sector, corruption, unemployment. But I think what we missed, it is for us to craft our national agenda, to build our national consciousness after 1994. We never even resolved the question of the TRC. If you look at the issues of the transitional justice, because that's where economic injustices were committed against our own people by losing their land, by losing their dignity. And that's where, when you look at many reports of the United Nations for the past 3 years, they were talking about the Sub-Sahara, including South Africa, that we are not an equal country or an equal community of practice, but there is an inequality that is also taken by what I will tell you, the issue of imperialists and colonists who are still here. We might not have colonialism, but we are still suffering from what I will call the colonized minds are still suffering from the effects of the colonizer. And the same colonizer is funding many political parties who are now contesting for power in many African countries. So we must be worried about this nature of a colonizer who just disappear and come back again under the pretext of telling us also again that we are still having challenges, when actually we should be overcoming those challenges by demanding reparations, by demanding restoration of the human dignity, by not having what I will say, Mbali, if you were there today, you will see that even the other nations or races, they still don't attend national commemorative days. We still have a problem as if we are talking amongst ourselves, and we are not talking to the right person or the right communities that have benefited unjustly and illegally in this country past 1994. And if we have to move towards 2030, to move towards 2034 or 2044 for the coming generation, is to always raise this question. why the colonizer benefited and they were never brought to pay back what they have stolen from this country. Because remember the wealth tax that came out from the TRC reparation recommendation, it was never followed up. And that's where we are still suffering from all these socio-economic challenges that are facing South Africa and its neighboring countries and the whole continent. And that's the nature of what I call the last stage of imperialism, which is neo-colonialism, as it was said by Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana.
And Sipho, some of the issues you are mentioning are really some of the problems that former President Thabo Mbeki recently touched on, especially when it comes to a society that we are building and this rainbow nation we had aspired to be in 1994. When we look at some of the challenges that remain in the country, of course, one cannot dispute and deny that there have gains been made in South Africa. At the same time, Sipho, what would you say stands out for you 30 years onwards from 1994?
But what will stand out for me and for many of our collective thinkers, we are always saying that we have at least the freedom of speech. We have what I will call the academic freedom. We might have access to basic needs for now that are limited. But also we need to understand that for us to defeat the apartheid and to defeat all the elements that came during apartheid, it was important for for the present generation to benefit also for those who have fought for this country. And secondly, we cannot be pessimistic or be negative always. It is important also for us to see that we have a political tolerance in this country. We are going for the 7 democratic elections where we have never seen violence that it goes to a level where in many African countries they're always going to the war or there is no government at all. So I can say to you, our electoral democracy have shaped and it has been shaken by many political parties engaging in this political or election cycle. And secondly, we have seen that education, we have more institutions of higher learning, even if we are not doing more, but we needed to have more than 30 or 40 universities in this country so that we can have access to education. Going to the health sector also, we needed to move away from privatized health sector and have all those private hospitals being turned into public hospitals. And thirdly, again, we need to look at the issue of this bloated government positions that are given to many political cadres. Because I think what other aspect we are missing in this country is to have this many cadres who are occupying positions, but we are lacking competency, we are lacking consciousness from them. What we see is always corruption, because the issue of corruption, I will say to you, we have not won that battle. And all of us, we cannot say all is well when we know very well that the issue of the Zondo Commission is still hanging and many court cases are still hanging around many political leaders.
And Sipho, earlier on, you touched a bit on that South Africa is not the only one celebrating Freedom Day today. We have other countries on the African continent and the likes of Sierra Leone and as well as Togo. What lessons can South Africa learn from those freedoms and that we can incorporate in today's lifetime, despite some of the challenges that you pointed out, like these other countries also facing energy problems?
No, correctly. Togo is going for the legislative elections next week on the 29th. What I've picked up is that they're having more women representation in parliament, and I think that's what South Africa can learn. To have a deputy president of a woman in this country, it will be what we must aspire. Secondly, when you look at Sierra Leone, they are still having serious challenges, Sierra Leone, in terms of dealing with their natural resources and also dealing with what we call after effects of the pandemics of Ebola, of COVID-19. And I think that's how South Africa must also learn how to deal with those issues of coming out from the colonizer. Like we share the same colonizer with Sierra Leone, the British Empire. And that's how we must move away from the dependency syndrome, because we cannot talk of independence days and freedom days, but we are still not free. We are still looking at the West. So I think all these 3 countries, as they are looking at their Independence Day, at their Freedom Day, they must move away from dependency syndrome of the West and rely on their internal community resources, which is their community, which is their natural resources. And that's where I say many African countries who have liberation or freedom must understand what is the price of that freedom and liberation. So to learn from those countries who have almost 63 years being free from their colonizers, but they're still having challenges of power, of state machinery, of development and growth, because our theme for this year, for 30 years, it is talking about partnership, growth, development. And we know, Walter Rodney reminded us how Europe underdeveloped Africa, but it appears as if Africa is now developing Europe, and we need to move from that syndrome of being dependent to the West, but rely on the African continent.
All right, Mr. Mantula, thank you so much for your time this evening. That is Advocate Sipho Mantula. He's a researcher and human rights activist, just giving us his insight when it comes to his reflections on 30 years of democracy and, of course, Freedom Day.